Every Friday morning, the Brothers of Holy Cross Choir spend an hour in what we call faith sharing, in which an individual is able to, whoever the facilitator is, and I was this week, we talk about journeys of faith. We may talk about the household, we may talk about the order in general, we may talk about the church, we may talk about anything that relates to our faith and the journey of faith. And because I was assigned to preach this Sunday, and since we usually base the context of our discussions on the Sunday readings, I thought my brothers would be helpful to me in constructing this sermon. They were not. The other two who are preaching today have chosen to use the epistle instead. So I was stuck to pull this conversation together, and therefore this sermon. So I have some interesting help from some interesting resources, which I will share with you as I go forward. So here we go. I have read and reread this Sunday's Gospel many times this week. I have felt tugged and conflicted as I hear opposite voices screaming for attention and dominance in this text. I felt like I was drowning in a sea of voices. This is the second or probably the third week in a row that Matthew has presented parables that are not readily clear for understanding. The other issue with many of these parables, at least from scholars, New Testament scholars, is since they're parables of Jesus, it's not quite clear from reading the parables what Jesus actually said. And so the distance of interpretation enlarges, as it were. So locating then the meaning of any passage in Scripture means paying attention to several ways to decipher the reading itself. Canon Stephen mentioned 3 last week, and I will this morning mention 3 that I have used to look at this text and offer the reflection that I'll be reflecting. The first is to look in the parable itself. That is, what does it actually say? What's the storyline, the historical context, and how people who actually listened to, who heard for the first time, actually understood it. The second is to look around the parable, asking how this parable has been used and interpreted by the church throughout the ages. And the third is to look at, read it, and respond to it based on what's happening in our own congregation here at the moment, our city, our church, our own life. And that affects how we read, listen to, and interpret this text. I found myself this week, after many years of reading this over and over, paying more attention to the third one, which is in front of, rather than around, trying to figure out what the church has taught for centuries, and to some degree in the historical context. We all do that. I just want to be upfront about that and just identify my social location in terms of reflecting on this text. I find that this parable, and I have read this, and what I'm going to say to you is nothing that I have ever said before when talking about this text or even preaching on this text. And when I went back and looked at previous sermons about this text, I chose not to use them and realized I had moved to a different place. So I would be cheating to repeat something that in some senses I no longer believe or saw in the text. So I had to do real homework. I find this parable speaks on several levels. One is a story of how the rich get richer. The story plot itself opens up how this is done. Essentially, the master rewards and applauds 2 clever slaves, but punishes the third slave, whom he calls wicked and slothful. He takes what he entrusted to the third slave and gives it to the first. And interesting is another fact. The rich man does not deny the slave's assessment of his motivation or his character or his own personhood. The slave was punished in many ways because he was unable to make a profit for the rich man. That's essentially what the story says. John Coach is a biblical scholar who teaches at Georgetown University, talks about this story as being a favorite among American capitalists who are only interested in profits. And the second one, which I'm most familiar with, are fundamentalists who focus on the unintended and textually unsupported meaning of the word talent. Talent in this story is about currency. It's not about giftedness or gifts or any of it. And yet we've always turned this around to talk about a different reality. Often we use this gospel when we're having fundraising and making appeals and trying to acquire more money for the church. This gospel traditionally used. And so therefore, in many ways, the talent that's been interpreted comes from this text for which it has no rationale. So I leave that out there as well. He asks, and I ask, and probably John asks, the listeners who heard this were neither capitalists or committed to self-improvement. They were simply peasants. And he asked a question that I had to ask myself. Would these interpretations, these two that I mentioned, bring good news to the peasants, to the persons who heard this message? We also notice that the rich man is greedy. It is only toward the end of the parable that we learn that he is also unjust. He is a hard man. Reap where he does not sow, as the third slave points out. And as I said earlier, the rich man doesn't disagree with this. His response is to take what he gave him and give it to someone else. And we also notice that the first two slaves were honored for imitating their master. The audience in Jesus' time, reflecting on this parable in their own life, would not find this parable good news. People living on the margins of society today would also not find this good news. They would conclude, if this is an example of how God works, and that's often one of the ways in which this parable is interpreted, then God is no better than the rich man, and then who needs God? What Matthew might be suggesting, however, is that while we await the return of Jesus, remember, Matthew's writing to a church in which expectations of Jesus' return would be occurring in their own lifetime. It was only after 40 years when the Christian church realized Jesus was not coming back that much teaching and what we call church organization was put in place to carry this message and institutionalize this message further, because at that point we no longer knew when Jesus was coming. But when this story was written, people expected the eschaton to come in their own lifetime. So what Matthew might have been saying to the people in the Jerusalem church is that while they would wait for the return of Jesus, they should not be lazy, imitate the cleverness of the two slaves, but not the greed of the master and his two servants. So what I want to do from this point on is present what I'm going to call an alternative meaning to this parable and a retelling of this story. If you take the two slaves on one hand and the third slave as alternate voices, we can see the tensions that both voices present. Both sides pull us in many directions. These different voices tell us different things, and each voice carries its own truth. On the one hand, there is the voice represented by the third slave, beckoning us towards self-sacrifice, self-renunciation, altruism, heroism, telling us that happiness lies in giving life away, that selfishness will make us unhappy, and that we will only be ourselves when we are big-hearted, generous, and put the needs of others before our own. Deep down, we know the truth of that. Jesus preached that. It is the voice of Jesus telling us that there is no greater love nor meaning than to lay down one's life for others. Francis of Assisi was right. We only receive by giving. And so we admire people who radiate that, and we feed our souls and those of our children with stories of heroism, selflessness, and big-heartedness. But that is only one voice in this parable. The first two slaves speak a powerful, persistent voice, seemingly calling us in the opposite direction. Specifically, this is the voice calling us toward pleasure, comfort, and security. It is also the voice that tells us to take care of ourselves, drink in life's pleasures to the full, to seize the day while it is still ours to have. Moreover, this is a voice that challenges us not to be too timid or fearful to be a full human being. This voice invites us to participate in, contribute to, and enjoy the wonderful energy, color, wit, intelligence, and creativity that makes the world go round and makes life worth living. This is the voice beckoning to us toward romance, creativity, art, sex, achievement, physical health. The voice telling us Jesus' parable of the talents and holding before us a truth too often neglected in religious circles, namely that God is also the author of eros, color, physical health, wit, intelligence. Life, it insists, needs to be tasted in God's name. So what is the real voice then? Is one of these voices to be heeded and the other resisted? This is why this parable is so problematic. We are faced with the temptation to oversimplify the voice of Jesus with the voice that calls us towards self-sacrifice and asceticism. But Jesus also made it clear that our failure to take heed of the rest of what they have preached has sometimes made for a spirituality that is a half-truth with some nasty results. Namely, in the name of religion, we have sometimes become unhealthy, fearful, timid, and guilt-ridden. Whenever this happens, the other voice, the one inviting us to enter more fully into life's dance of energy, is not blotted out but driven underground. And there, because we have neglected part of what God has called us to, instead of becoming martyrs, we become people with martyr complexes. Frustrated persons whose energies become negative and manipulative in the name of love and service. Moreover, in the name of this half-truth, of choosing one or claiming one only exists over the other, we often end up having God fighting God, truth fighting truth, wisdom fighting energy, and spiritual health fighting physical health. Because we put self-renunciation in false opposition to the challenge to also enter the wonderful God-given image of this planet, where beauty, romance, creativity, physical health, wit, even wine drinking, and good humor also extend and is part of God's authentic invitation to each and every one of us. If both voices, one represented by the two slaves and the other by the third slave, both invite us to truth, and yet they seem in opposition to each other, where do we go with this? There is no simple truth, first of all. Truth is painfully complex, and truth is always bigger than our capacity to absorb it and integrate it. To be open to truth is to be perpetually stretched and perpetually in tension. Maybe the tension is the recognition that we are called to risk at whatever price in personal discomfort, isolation, or distress. It might also mean divesting ourselves of the luxury of cultural, racial, or religious chauvinism. It might involve us embracing that we are one and must embrace each other as brothers and sisters who cross not only class and racial barriers, but language, culture, and geography. In other words, we must enter a new understanding that all of us are one in Christ. That is the only voice we need to hear. Amen.